recorded.
Good day. Welcome to the Conflict of Interest, a Governance Perspective conference call. My name is Lee and I will be your operator for today. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, and later we will conduct a question-and-answer session. If any of you require operator assistance, please press star 0 and I will be happy to assist you. I would now like to turn the conference over to your host for today, Ms. Susan Shiflett, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility of CHI. Please proceed.
Thanks, and welcome everyone to the quarterly webcast for board and board committee members. Our name, as Shelley mentioned, is Conflicts of Interest. As she said, I'm Susan Shiflett, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for CHI. And with me today is Mark Stockey, who is the Tax Director for CHI. My focus on the content today will be more from a general perspective for conflicts of interest, and Mark's focus is going to be from tax implications. To get started with the content, I wanted to offer a reflection, and the reflection from the most recent edition of the CHI Sacred Stories. So I'll just set yourselves in the presence of your God. It's called Give God the Glory, and it was submitted by Sherry Clark from the Kentucky One organization in Kentucky. Dr. had been Dad's doctor for years. He Dad in his home, and over time they had become friends. They would discuss their faith and life in general. When Dad declined due to diabetes, he moved to be closer to me. Fortunately, he could no longer see Dr. O due to the geographic distance. Well, full circle. Dad found himself at St. Mary's and Elizabeth Hospital to have a low-knee amputation. He the day before the surgery for pre-op treatment. So on the staff at the hospital, so I called to let him know, my dad, about my surgery. He said come and see Dad the next morning. My brother and I arrived at the hospital to spend time with Dad before surgery. When he came, Dad was transported to the holding room in the operating suite. My brother and I sat with Dad, trying to keep his mom occupied before the impending amputation. As we sat, Dad said, "Guess who came to see me this morning?" I then said, "Dr. O." Dad went on to tell me that Dr. O held his hands, praised him, and sang a song. Dad sobbing and told us he would never forget Dr. O's visit. He kept repeating, "Who does that? Who does that?" Acts of love and friendship meant so much to Dad. Dr. O is a busy man, but he took the time to minister to the needs of his patient. He made Dad feel like he was his only patient. When Dr. O thanked him, he replied, "Give God glory." We experienced God's glory through Dr. O that day. He and a friend. He is a reminder of how our lives, if we choose to share them, be a blessing to those in need. In prayer, I wanted to share this scripture, Mark 16, verse 15. And them, go to the world and preach the good news to all creation. And with that, we'll get started. I did want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and there will be instructions on how to access the recording sometime next week. And we'll open the lines up for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So the objective today is to increase your knowledge of conflicts of interest from a governance perspective. So we'll cover, what constitutes a conflict of interest, what are the risks associated with conflicts, what internal controls does CHI have in place to prevent or manage conflict of interest, and from a governance perspective, what is your role it relates to conflicts of interest. And, why did we pick this topic? And how is it important to you as a board member? One of the things is to increase your understanding of current government scrutiny regarding financial relationships between individuals and the organizations that they serve. Understanding also how CHI is responding to and complying with some changes to regulations and also just some of the regulations. So the conflict. A conflict of interest exists when the personal interests of an individual or individual's family members or business may affect the ability of the individual to act in the best interest of and with good faith and loyalty to CHI, to its CHI's mission, its patients, clients, research participants. Conflict of interest can be considered to exist in any instance, individuals' decisions, actions, or activities on behalf of CHI also involve obtaining direct or indirect personal gain or advantage, and could be in the form of compensation, cash gifts, or other items of value, or create an adverse or potentially adverse effect on CHI's interests. I'm talking about individuals here. That's inclusive of board and board committee members, CHI employees, staff members, and also researchers. And into a little more detail about how, some of the brief changes to CHI conflict of interest policy. Examples of potential conflicts of interest: relationships with vendors, competitors, outside interest holders. So the personal interest of an individual may conflict with the interest of CHI if that individual is somebody who is doing business with or seeks to do business with, or is a competitor of CHI. Maybe it's somebody who holds a material financial interest with an individual or entity, or potentially is a creditor, individual or entity that competes with or is engaged with some type of transaction with CHI or CHI entity. Other potential conflict is diversion of corporate opportunity. This is when an individual wants to instead CHI of a corporate opportunity and instead diverts the opportunity to himself or herself or an immediate family member, and it would be to the detriment of CHI, so not in the best interest of CHI. Another is disclosure of confidential or inside information. This would be a conflict, and this would include like public or privileged or confidential information would relate to the business of CHI, or use such information for personal profit or some kind of personal advantage. If we have conflict of interest, or an immediate family member of that individual set gifts, such as cash equivalents, excessive entertainment, unsecured loans, or waivers from an outside individual or entity. And this is especially important when outside individual or entity is either does already do business with CHI or is seeking to do business with CHI or is a competitor. Because this type of activity might be inferred that this was intended to influence people's decisions, actions, or activities. Those are just some of the examples of potential conflict that you need to be aware of. The risk of not actively monitoring and managing potential conflicts of interest could potentially jeopardize CHI's tax exempt and could be in violation of certain regulations, which I'll go into later, such as START, anti-kickback, and certain research regulations. And Mark will talk about some of the potential tax law implications or violations, such as private inurement, private benefit, and excess benefit transactions. So, regulatory considerations. The federal government recently issued new regulations within the past couple years that are training and management of conflicts of interest. And then is the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, and I'm sure you've already heard about this particular act. It requires pharmaceutical and medical device companies to report to the centers of Medicare, Medicaid, or CMS payments to physicians and teaching hospitals, as well as reporting physician ownership or investment interest. And this information is now being posted to public websites. So you can go out there and do a Google search on any physician and get all kinds of information. The revised CHI conflict of interest policy includes that physicians holding medical staff privileges at CHI entities be required to disclose physician-owned entity relationships. And this is outlined in CHI's physician-owned entity policy, or what we lovingly refer to as the POE policy. And you should also be aware of that policy at your entities that you serve. Rules governing research that addresses complex financial interests, medical and behavioral researchers, and these complex financial interests result in interactions between government research institutions and private sector. So something that is fairly recent that we need to be aware of. And we have to be cognizant of, the anti-kickback statute, which prohibits individuals and entities from knowingly offering, paying, receiving remuneration to induce referrals of items of services are paid by federally funded healthcare programs. And of course, the Stark Law that prohibits physicians from referring Medicare and Medicaid patients to provider if the physician and the provider have a financial relationship, and there is no Stark exception in place. Some of the ones that we have to consider anytime we talk about conflicts of interest. So, internal controls that are in place. Well, the first one is obviously a conflict of interest policy. And CHI has had a conflict of, actually, it's had multiple conflict of interest policies over the years. And this policy helps, especially a tax-exempt organization such as CHI, where its board's decisions are made in an objective manner, without undue influence by persons who may have a private interest in is being considered by the board or by the organization. It helps the organization ensure that its charitable purposes are being fulfilled, that director and officer activities are properly overseen. Because of the increased regulatory scrutiny that I talked about earlier, this made by CHI leadership to revise CHI's conflict of interest policy, but also with its process. So, multiple existing conflict of interest policies were combined into a single policy, and also to ensure compliance with some of these newer regulations, individuals that the policy is now applicable to includes all independent medical staff members and researchers. Previously, it only included employed individuals. Of course, it includes all, the CHI Board of Stewardship trustees, and CHI boards that have fiduciary duties, and committee members and CHI employees. So in a single conflict of interest policy, a few other changes were made. The conflict of interest processes were standardized across the organization, across the enterprise, actually. There are several abilities of how the process was being handled at the various organizations, and we really wanted to use this process to decrease that variability and have really more accountability around the process. So it includes the disclosure review process that's centralized, again, to be standardized across the organization and to promote accountability. Extensive conflict of interest education and awareness was provided, was done in various ways, whether through webinars, similar to this. We've also included that information in our annual CRP, or Corporate Responsibility Program edition, that now in process for employees. Also, as mentioned earlier, participants now include all medical staff members and researchers, not just employed members. And, as you hope, the conflict of interest process of distributing the questionnaires has been automated, as opposed to the previous manual process that was in place. And you've all have received and completed your conflict of interest disclosure questionnaires sent electronically through email last fall. And if you have not, and if you have questions or need any assistance in completing the questionnaire, feel free to contact your local corporate responsibility officer for assistance. You know, you can also feel free to email me, Susan Flitt at catholichealth.net. I'd be happy to provide you with that assistance. So, what is the board's fiduciary duty as it relates to conflicts of interest? I'm sure you're very familiar with the fiduciary duties that are listed on this slide: duty of oversight, duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. I wanted to just focus briefly on the duty of care and the duty of loyalty as it relates to or applicable to conflicts of interest. Requires board members to make decisions in good faith, with care that a prudent person exercise and in the best interest of the organization. This is really true with regards to potential conflicts of interest. Would be expecting that management has mechanisms in place to identify, review, and resolve conflicts, and you can rely on the information that is provided to you as a board member. But it'll cause you to ask questions, clarification before making any decisions as it relates to the conflict of interest process for you. And then loyalty requires that you act unselfishly. You disclose actual or potential conflicts of interest, you competition or conflicting interests, for a contractor in the community that does business with CI or has a potential to do business with the CI entity. That's a potential conflict of interest. So it's important for you to disclose that and have it reviewed through the defined CHI review process. So the loyalty requires you to protect the confidentiality of non-public information. For example, sharing information related to total business acquisition with a competitor, that you wouldn't share that information with a competitor of CHI. Just from the perspective of disclosure or potential conflicts of interest. So anytime there might be a situation that could create a conflict of interest, And whenever you become aware of that, you must fully disclose that to the board chair. And in doubt, full disclosure should be made to permit an objective review and resolution of that potential conflict. And then, of course, on an annual basis, you're required to complete a conflict of interest questionnaire. So how does a board member avoid liability? Well, first of all, be proactive and disclose any potential conflict like we just mentioned. And a really good practice is at the beginning of a board meeting, the board chair should ask if there are any potential conflicts of interest by any member. This should be standard. This should be a standard agenda item. If there are any potential conflicts, the process outlined in the CHI's conflict of interest policy should be followed. You know, certain conflicts of interest transactions could be okay. And I mentioned too, going back to, you know, at the beginning of a board meeting and the board chair ask if there are any potential conflicts. It's important that you take to board committee or board materials prior to the meeting so that you can be aware of what is being discussed, what is being considered, and be able to determine at that point if you think there would be a conflict. So, are certain conflicts of interest transactions okay? Yes. The factors are fully disclosed. Action is in the best interest of CHI. Disclosing board member does not participate in the discussion and vote regarding a matter that is in question. So it's not saying that, so give, for example, if a conflict of interest is being considered and one of the members has disclosed that there might be a conflict, that individual might have some information about that particular item that should provide that information during that meeting. However, when there's action, and any vote, that person would have to recuse themselves from that particular, for the rest of the discussion, and certainly the vote. So of a deal of actions that we read, what an example is Kevin Lofton's appointment to the Rite Aid board. The CHI board reviewed the situation per CHI policy. The board needed to ensure that there was no potential conflict between Kevin, the Rite Aid, and CHI, and the appointment would not infringe on Kevin's ability to continue to perform his role as CHI's CEO. After review, the CHI board found the matter to be okay. It was important to go through that review process and transparent about that situation. And a resolution of any conflict of interest needs to be fully documented and supported. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to Mark to talk about the tax implications related to COI.
Thank you. And I think I go through these tax slides with a common theme that I saw on the Susan's last slide of, you know, fairness, documentation, disclosure. Those are all important concepts as we look at some of the tax issues. So with the basic concepts, as exempt org, you know, in contrast to a for-profit corporation that's organized for the shareholders to enrich the shareholders, as a charitable organization and will be granted tax-exempt status for a public benefit not benefit any private individual. And there are two basic concepts that the IRS looks to force the status and benefit and the reason for our existence. And they're different in their scope. The private benefit doctrine basically states and that we provide to the public that would be to an individual has to be incidental, which means substantial in comparison to our public benefit, or it's necessary to achieve the public benefit. And I think a couple examples best illustrate this point. One, as employees, they're salaried. That benefit to those individuals, but without the employees, we could not achieve our public benefit. Another example would be, an organization that formed to benefit maybe a park or a lake, cleanup or restoration, is definite public benefit. If there's properties adjoining locations, there'll be some private benefit as well in terms of increased property values, but that's all incidental to the public benefit. Whereas in contrast, if there was an organization formed just to move one block in a neighborhood, that obviously has significant public benefit. That's going to benefit those owners, and there's no real broad public benefit really there. The concept is more narrow. It's referred to as private inurement, and there's a couple terms here that I'll define as we go into the later slides. It looks to a non-market value transaction, which would be an excess benefit transaction with a disqualified person. And that is narrow. It's looking for those actions with a disqualified person. I'll move into the next slide to define what a disqualified person is. That's someone who currently, in the preceding 5 years, has some sort of substantial influence in the organization, or is a member of one of these individuals. And there is spouses, and then ancestors, and then children, grandchildren, etc., and their spouses. Voting members, you would meet the definition of disqualified person. And really defined as a disqualified person would be someone to implement the decisions of the governing body, which would be the officers or anyone who had officer-type responsibilities regardless of their title. Another relationship of two would be if a person has an interest in an entity such as a corporation or a partnership, and that entity would become a disqualified person as a result of that relationship. So we'd have to watch any kind of transactions between the exempt org and those entities. Let's have the cut and dry disqualified persons. There's also facts and circumstances tests that the IRS can look at, and that's in the next slide. There's good facts, bad facts. If you're a sole contributor or you found the organization, you would be deemed or potentially be deemed to be a qualified person. If you have a vow of poverty or your direct supervisor isn't a disqualified person, that would be a good fact. So there's that subjective stuff there. We just have to monitor, the facts and circumstances. So moving to talk about, as I mentioned, private inurement looks at between the disqualified person and nation, and should that transaction be deemed reasonable whereas the amount of benefit given to that disqualified person would exceed the consideration given, then we may potentially have an excess benefit transaction. This would be compensation that would be excess to fair market value, below market rent, the organization rents, the person at below market. Converse, the disqualified person could rent their property to the organization at well above fair market value. Loans would be another example. Certain transactions that are likely consist benefit transaction, and those are what we call income, unreported income to the IRS. So if side services to the organization and is not issued W-2 or 1099, that would automatically be an excess benefit transaction. There is an that's called contract exemption. The party has a relationship with the organization. This is the initial contract. So if someone in the organization as an officer, before there's no relationship, not a qualified person, and that initial contract, if it has fixed terms, will be considered a benefit. It's considered an arm's length negotiation. However, if there's any available component to that act that could be subject to, you'd have to be looked at for potential excess benefit. And variable component means board discretion, for example, over whether to provide individual with a bonus. If it's a fixed for bonus, whereas if the organization achieves X, then the individual would receive X. That would be okay. That's fixed. It's objective. But if there's any discretionary component to it, then it would not fall under this exemption, and will need to be to look for potential excess benefit. So on to the slide. Intermediate sanctions. Now, in the past, if in one of these transactions, there had 2 ways to go. Both, they could, obviously they don't want to do, or they could revoke exemption. Really, this, drastic. It's not really fair to the organization just because of the actions of a few individuals. So what came up with was this concept of intermediate sanctions, which says taxes parties involved in excess benefit transactions. So it's a tax on the qualified person, the person receiving the benefit, and potentially a tax on a manager who is also knowingly involved. So next slide, I'll kind of get to the taxes that are assessed. So the qualified person would get a tax or be assessed a tax of 25% of that excess benefit. Contract for sale of property, the disqualified person, the sale from the qualified person to the organization, the fair market value of that property was, say, $100, but the organization paid $200. So we have an excess benefit of $100. The person will be required to restore the organization plus pay a 25% tax on that $100 excess. Expected to assess a 200% penalty. And is really restoring the organization to as if the transaction did not occur. And preferred, but you could also restore property, but always include interest. And keep in mind as we go through these taxes, the IRS still has the ability, if it's they consider an egregious situation, to revoke exempt status. Moving to the next slide. So as a manager, which was, as we discussed, included a board member, there is potential for a tax of 10% of that excess benefit. That's $70,000 jointly liable if there's more than one manager participating. Yes, has the burden of here. They need to prove that the manager participated. If the person wasn't willful, which is voluntary, conscious, and intentional, under reasonable cause, they may or would not assess the penalty. So the manager would really need to be aware that the transaction was an excess benefit. And we'll also say you have a duty to speak. So if you were silent, but that would be an excuse to get the penalty. And we're to the next slide. Their ability to abate if the IRS decides there was reasonable cause and everyone's been restored to where before the transaction, it's not willful, and they can abate penalty to the disqualified person, which would then automatically abate the penalty to the manager. And just a quick note on these taxes, if the disqualified person is also the manager in this case, they can be subject to full penalties. Which I think ties into Susan ended her presentation. How do we protect ourselves as an organization? Obviously, or a disqualified person, we don't want to be subject to the taxes. Or in the worst case, you lose our tax exempt status. So there's a concept out there called the rebuttable presumption. And this will protect the qualified persons and the organization managers because it shifts the burden of proof if we can satisfy condition. Being the transaction is approved in advance by an authorized body with no conflict of interest with respect to the transaction. The body cannot have any kind of conflict. If a board member, it's a transaction with their spouse that's considered, noting would satisfy that requirement. Second requirement, there has to be reliance on appropriate data. Now, the IRS can challenge if they feel the data isn't relevant or accurate. But what really helps you would be written opinion from attorney, CPA, and appraisal. So if we're selling a property, if a fair market value by a qualified appraiser, that qualifies as appropriate comparability data. The presentation requirement need to document in the minutes the gentleman when approved, who voted, what actions were taken, if of the board had a conflict, it needs to be documented within a certain time period, which is either later 60 days after the transaction or next meeting. Protection, and the man disqualified person and the nation's protection event or the burden of proof to the IRS in the event that they feel a transaction is an excess benefit transaction. We move to the next slide, tying this into the complaint side and what we report. And I think it's important here to remind everyone that a Form 990 that requires an exempt organization is a document. So anything we disclose there can be seen or requested by the public. 90 will identify the disqualified persons, the board members, and key officers and so forth. And we'll ask specific questions about whether there's transactions between the organization and individuals. And it's the excess benefit transactions, but it's clearly asked if there's excess benefit transactions. So we'd be required to disclose when to the potential IRS sanctions. We'd also have the potential, I guess, PR, or how does it appear to the public when this type of activity is going on. And so the tax department, and this is a common question, is why is the tax conflict of interest process set? What we look back after the fiscal year end and ask if any of these types of transactions have, so that we can identify them on. Moving to the next, which is, I guess, the takeaways, what we're hoping to kind of appear today and to leave you with. I wanted to start off here.
Firstly, you want to be familiar with CHI's conflict of interest policy and process, understand the implications of risks that are associated with conflicts of interest, because it potentially do jeopardize CHI's tax-exempt status and potentially puts us in violation with some other regulations. Also, asking questions. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the board meeting, the board chair asked if there are any potential conflicts of interest. Are you aware, or are you comfortable that management has put in place internal controls to mitigate any risk associated with conflicts of interest? And one of the things that is an internal control, obviously, is the conflict of interest policy, but there's also education that is provided, like Mark said. They provide education from the tax perspective. We provide education from the compliance perspective. Internal control, it could be internal control. If we receive hotline reports on compliance through our compliance reporting system, staff pose questions where they have concerns that there may be a conflict of interest. And then also just COI questionnaire process, an annual requirement that members need to complete a COI questionnaire. So any time that you feel there might be a potential for conflict, you have the obligation to talk with your board there. And then Mark.
Yeah, and then these tax just being all the IRS penalties, including revoking our exempt status. That's all out there. They can use that to if they feel there's transactions going on that are not proper, and all the things that Susan went over. That's the documentation, disclosure, asking questions, internal policies that really helps protect us, so that whether threatening of exempt status or even the penalties, that we won't find ourselves in that situation.
And Mark mentioned too that the tax process is separate from the compliance process, where the tax process looks back and we look ahead. So unfortunately, it is still two different processes.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, I think, Shelley, we'll open it up for questions.
Gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. If your question has been answered or you would like to withdraw your question, please press star 2.
Cooper, the Corporate Responsibility Officer for Catholic Health Initiatives. And while we're waiting for questions to come in the queue, one thing I thought might be helpful is if you and Mark could describe conflict of interest disclosure process. What board members may be queried twice a year versus once a year, and maybe just distinguish between the time around that.
Sure.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, it goes back to effective versus retrospective. We look back after the figure end is over to attempt to identify any types of these transactions or conflicts, whereas I believe Susan, process would look at the beginning of the year to identify if there's anything.
Right. Like with I explained earlier, how we just automated our system or the disclosure process. It is, looking forward where you think there might be a potential conflict, not just from the annual question that you fill out, but also any time you think there might be a potential conflict. Again, making sure that you have that conversation with your board chair so that there can be appropriate review and analysis of the situation.
To the tax process, we make some changes recently. We moved to the online format, in the hopes of making this an easier process for everyone. In the event that you ever have feedback on how things are going, and just please feel free to reach out to the tax group because we always welcome feedback.
Yeah, you may not have yet complete the conflict of interest questionnaire was just electronically through email. And like I said, feel free to contact your local corporate responsibility officer for assistance, or feel free to give me a call, or you can email me at susanshiflett@catholichealth.net. We need to help you through that process. Shelley, are there questions?
And that comes from the line of Pete, sir. Please proceed.
When a potential conflict of interest has been in place, that board member should not participate in the discussion or action. Should they leave the room during that, or can they stay in the room and be quiet?
They should leave the room.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we had no further questions in the queue.
And this is Michelle Cooper again. I'll just add that one of the reasons why we do ask the individual and why it's a best practice for the individual to leave the room is, a lot of times they'll be sharing confidential information. If there's a bidding process and another particular individual that is bidding for our business, they're sharing confidential information. There may be ability to read body language, or there may be sidebar conversations. So it makes it much cleaner if that individual isn't in the room, and it also helps prevent any possibility that anybody could, that there would be any trust issues or other issues that might arise by sharing confidential pricing information.
One thing around that, depending on the situation, a trustee or a corporate officer may have to provide position in that matter, and answering pertinent questions from the board to glean some knowledge. But at the end of the day, that person would still have to recuse themselves from any further participation in the discussion or any vote. Sally, any
Questions in the queue?
Okay, well, thank everybody for participating in this webcast today. If you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact Mark or myself or your local corporate responsibility officer. We'll end the call and have a great weekend.
Ladies and today's conference, thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect and have a great day.